Hello everybody, welcome to the Patriot Show. I am Anthony Stephen Malone, your host, and today we have a very special guest who is with us on the Patriot Show, Roy McComb, former Deputy Director, National Crime Agency and consultant on international transitional crime organisations and law enforcement. Hello Roy, how are you doing mate, you alright?
Hello Anthony, good to be with you, and a very impressive introduction there, so I hope I live up to the intro.
Mate, I obviously know a little bit about you. You have got one hell of a background and a history. You've done a lot.
Thank you.
You've got a lot of experience out there. So I hope my viewers can enjoy this particular interview.
Me too. Me too.
Now, can you tell my viewers a little bit about your background, please?
I can, yes. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for anybody who's watching and listening. So, yeah, Roy McComb, I'm career law enforcement in the United Kingdom and now internationally. I started my law enforcement career in the mid-1980s, working for the Royal Ulster Constabulary as a police officer. And I completed 30 years in the RUC, which then became the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And I finished then as the head of organised crime in Northern Ireland as a detective chief superintendent. And in 2014, I moved across to the National Crime Agency, which is the United Kingdom's lead for serious and organised crime. And I was a deputy director in the NCA and with the privilege of working there for about 5 years in various posts. Dealing with a variety of different crime types, human trafficking, child sexual abuse, and lots of other matters. And from 2019 onwards, I've now worked as an international consultant working around the world on organised crime matters, human trafficking, and the like, and talking to people who are prepared to listen about the threat of organised crime and sharing some of my experiences of where I've been and what I've been involved in. So it's a good pleasure to be with you today, Anthony.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We could talk about things for hours and hours, okay? But I want to this is only going to be like a brief overview about your work and your experience as well on this. Can you tell us a little bit about the connections between international terrorism and organised crime?
Well, I think I have a very personal perspective on this because in my policing career, I grew up in a terrorist environment in Northern Ireland. The Troubles, as they were known as, took over 3,000 lives. You know, thousands of people were seriously injured, many injured to a level where their lives were never the same. Hundreds and thousands of bombs, shooting incidents. It was just the daily activity of dealing with terrorism. But there is a danger, I think, of people thinking of terrorism as something different than crime. So all terrorism is simply, in my view, a form of crime. And organised crime is predominantly driven by a profit motive, and terrorism is driven by a desire to kill. So in my view, the journey of it, if you want to look at it, of someone who's involved in terrorism and someone who's involved in organised crime can be quite closely mapped. So let me give you, for instance, so if you take the Provisional IRA, who were the predominant terrorist organisation in Northern Ireland, and then you compare it to a sophisticated organised crime group, both of those organisations develop an intention to do something. Right? One wants to kill and one wants to make money, but they both set out to gather intelligence about their target. They both develop a structure that makes it difficult for law enforcement to penetrate and to tackle. They both have covert means by which they communicate. They both have access to the tools of their trade, whether it's firearms or explosives. They both use the internet. They both use secure transportation to move their capability around, and they work usually in cellular structures, quite close knit, and there are lots of other parallels by which one conducts their business to to make money as an organized crime group, and one commits terrorist activity. So the parallels are quite obvious in many ways. In terms of international terrorism, if you're an international organized crime group, what you have is an ability to conduct long distance crime. So if you're involved in the drugs trade, you've got connections internationally. If you're in the middle of England, for the sake of argument, and you want to bring drugs in, oftentimes that's through an intermediary who will be themselves probably international, or you might have direct engagement. Some of the more sophisticated groups in the United Kingdom have connections direct into the source countries, whether in South America or into the Middle East, where drugs are being moved. You have an international capability. What you want to do is to move your product securely, safely, and quickly from the host country through to the destination so that you can make your money. Well, if you're involved in international terrorism, likewise, you want to be able to move people, you want to be able to move money, you want to be able to move firearms, explosives, you want to move intelligence, you want to be able to move the information. The parallels, I think, are quite stunning. Now, of course, they differ insofar as there's a different intention, and they often differ because of the personalities being the same. So I think I hear quite a lot of people saying the people involved in terrorism are not also involved in organized crime. And for the most part, that's true. But I think there's a real challenge of those of us who have been involved in organized crime or terrorism investigations, keeping our minds open to the fact that all there needs to be is a crossover point where people can share that information, can share their experience, and can share that level of knowledge. If I was a terrorist group in the United Kingdom and I wanted access to commercially capable firearms, the best way to do it would be to engage with a local organized crime group who I know to be involved in firearms trafficking. And that's almost the easiest route. So instantaneously, you've got a connection between firearms trafficking for organized crime and a terrorist group that wants to use those firearms for terrorist purposes. So, I mean, these two phenomena are different, but in my view, they bleed over each other routinely and regularly, and something we all need to be mindful of, because I think there's a real danger of seeing them as two absolutely distinct phenomena that never meet.
Yeah, I think that is very, very important. I think the old days, I think from how things were set 20 years ago to how they are set now, there is definitely a lot of overlaps between organized crime, international organized crime, and international terrorism. Definitely overlaps, references firearms, narcotics, money laundering as well. There's always overlaps there. You touched on the rat lines, on how they move things. Hyper important, because these rat lines from the Middle East and Central America are also used not just for one item. They could be used for high value targets, people smuggling, human organ smuggling. You've got explosives and you've got intelligence. They use their secure rat runs. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with all of that?
So, I mean, I give evidence to this to a parliamentary committee on this matter, on the broader challenge of organized crime. I mean, in essence, if you have established secure connections between your country, your destination, and the host country where you're trying to secure an item, and whether it's money, whether it's drugs, whether it's people, whether it is firearms, explosives, some other commodity, if you can develop relationships with people who are trusted at one end, and you can secure a pipeline, for want of a term, between that end and your end, and the thing is secure, it actually doesn't matter what you're trying to move, because your pipeline is secure. And I think there is the danger that if you look at some of the crossover in the criminality, the human trafficking people who are involved in parts of Africa particularly, they're moving people from parts of Africa through troubled zones where there are clear strongholds of terrorist activity. Now, you can't tell me that they're not doing that with the absolute knowledge of the terrorist groups that are there. Now, if I was involved in that, I'd be thinking, now, how do I maximize my ability to use those secure pipelines, and whether it's today to move people for prostitution or for some other human trafficking modality, or I want that secure pipeline to be used for the movement of firearms or explosives. Well, if you've built a secure pipeline, then what you put through that pipeline is a matter of choice. And that's where I think we must always be thinking about that crossover between terrorism and organized crime, because it's really so close. It's the same type of activity until it comes to the end. One wants to make money and one wants to kill, but at all points before that, the similarities in the approach are there and very clearly there for people to see. And the other thing I suppose I would make is we're in danger, I think, at times of thinking about these things as so different, and we investigate them with two different elements of law enforcement. So there's a counter-terrorism command in the United Kingdom, and there's a national crime agency that leads on organized crime. Now, they're not part of the same command, they're not even part of the same organization, they're entirely different, which forces them effectively to work together and to share information. But that becomes a slightly less smooth transition of information. If you had one agency that was tackling organized crime and terrorism as one, then I think the potential for sharing information and information being developed smoother might be improved. Scotland, for instance, when the Police Scotland was developed, they made a decision, partly based on the experiences that we had in Northern Ireland, of deciding that their organised crime and their counter-terrorism capabilities would actually be under one command. And that's quite a novel approach of seeing things, as effectively making sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that the crossovers and the fluidity of information and activity can be detrimental if you look at them in silos, as one is organised crime and one is terrorism. So I think the Scottish approach is one that is worth considering.
I think you're absolutely right on that one. I think the prominence of the overlaps in the past 5 to 10 years have become very poignant. I think everyone doing it under one organization could be a good idea, because sometimes, and we've heard the sayings 1,000,001 times, the politicalization of intelligence. Sometimes people don't want to share it. They don't realize how valuable it is. Intelligence should be out there for all organizations. That's the way it should be. After September 11th in America, people learned the hard way.
Yeah. Well, that's, if you go back to the 9/11 Commission, the phrase which I always remember is that the lights were blinking red. So there was sufficient information within the American intelligence agencies to know that there was something developing, but they didn't have the ability to put it all into one place and to have this fusion approach of information being shared in a fairly rapid sense. I mean, the other point I suppose I would make is the capability of those involved in high-end organized crime is not to be underplayed. The actual technical capability, and in this area I'm thinking particularly around the world of child sexual exploitation, which is just an horrific area to consider, but it is a prolific area of criminality. I mean, the amount of harm being caused to young and vulnerable children is just colossal. And it's being enabled by the internet, and probably the most sophisticated actors who are using the internet. I'm talking about the use of high-end encryption, of technical capability that really challenges law enforcement's approach to tackle it. It's been done by organized criminals. It's not being done to the same level of those involved in some terrorist organizations. Now, I grant you that there are people in some international terrorist organizations who do have that capability to use the high-end capabilities of the internet, and particularly the dark web, to their own advantage. But there could be many lessons from those most sophisticated organized crime groups who are using the likes of the dark web and high-end encryption to fullest advantage and fullest effect. I mean, there's plenty of conversations going on around the use of the likes of Facebook and other social media platforms, which are being used just day and daily to enable organized crime. Well, you know, if you're wanting to secure information and to pass it securely from one of your terrorist teams to another, you may not know how to do so. Well, actually, organized criminals have almost mastered that art in many ways. And so there's just a real challenge about making sure we don't think of these things as two separate and distinct phenomena that don't meet. I think that their crossovers are very much there to see.
Getting stronger. On that one, in the past 10 years, 20 years, technology has come on a long way for law enforcement, for intelligence agencies. The gear we've got now is phenomenal. But it's a double-edged sword as well, because the bad guys, the terrorist networks, organized crime, are also getting upgraded technology. What's your thoughts on this?
So I think we and I still think of myself as being involved in law enforcement because I've been there so long, I'm slightly house trained in that sense. But those of us who've been involved in law enforcement have watched the development of technology, and we have always felt that we've been the poor cousins, that we're always behind the technology curve. And I think that's just the nature of how sort of government agencies and law enforcement have to work. Because if you're a criminal, you don't have to abide by the rules. You don't have to do the procurement the way that an agency has to. You don't have to use it within certain rules and conditions. You just kind of buy the next piece of kit and you adapt it to your usage. So I think that there's always going to be a time whenever terrorists and criminals are using technology sooner, faster, quicker, and more effectively than law enforcement and the intelligence agencies. The challenge, I think, is trying to narrow the gap from them using it to their advantage and us using it to tackle them. We want to try and close down the gap as quickly as possible. For instance, in the world of child sexual abuse, the sex offenders learned and adapted their ability to use social media such as Facebook so much quicker than law enforcement did to identify the problem. But then we have to engage effectively and properly through effective channels and engage with Facebook and say, we would like you to do this to enable us. Law enforcement has to go through the hoops of engaging and talking and developing processes. Criminals don't. So they're always going to be leading the front. I remember some years ago about a process where they talked about crime proofing legislation so that there wouldn't be something that legislators would pass that would inadvertently create an opportunity for criminals to exploit. And for instance, more recently, Facebook decided that for their own reasons that they would encrypt their Facebook messenger services so that you would have end-to-end encryption. Now, if you're involved in law enforcement and you're using technology such as Facebook to access and to identify criminals, and then Facebook decides for their own reasons to encrypt that system, but what you've done is you've made law enforcement blind. And I read recently that the number of reported incidents of child sexual abuse being reported because of Facebook has dropped by about 50% in about 6 to 8 weeks. Now, I can tell you that's not 50% fewer occasions where children are being sexually abused. That's simply that number of times that's being reported. So that's 50% more children that are still being exposed and exploited. And so the danger is with technology, unless law enforcement is getting there quickly and understanding its capability, we simply create opportunities for criminals and terrorists to exploit far in advance of what law enforcement can.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of incredible work being done by all the law enforcement agencies out there, but when they're being hamstrung, for want of a better word, by other organisations, I think before big corporates make a decision, they should really consult with law enforcement just to make sure it isn't going to cause a bigger problem. Hopefully that can happen in the future. Just going to go back slightly, reference the people trafficking and the children trafficking. Obviously, I'm aware of a lot of things that are happening over in Europe and Africa at the moment. A lot of my viewers will not be aware of the problems with the human trafficking. How big a problem is that coming into Europe and the United Kingdom?
So human trafficking is not a new phenomena. It is, for as long as human beings have almost existed, there's been a history of slavery, and the memory of the slave trade from the United Kingdom and trafficking African slaves from the west coast of Africa to the United States, and the slave triangle between the UK, Africa, and America was, a huge business, and that still continues. It continues in a different guise nowadays. The last estimate, which I suspect is probably an undercount, has around 40 million people that are currently being held as slaves or are being trafficked on any given year. 40 million people. So that's a huge enterprise. To give you a sense of values for that, Anthony, that's a $5 billion business. $5 billion. I mean, that's a huge industry, and people that are involved in that have a very clear profit motive. And one way to think about it, if you're a drug dealer, if you're selling a kilo of cocaine, you can cut it, you can reduce it down to very low purity levels, and your 1 kilo can become 5 kilos, 10 kilos. But there are limits to how much you have and how much you can sell. And once you've sold it, then it's gone. It's sold. It can't be resold. If you traffic a young woman, for the sake of an example, from Asia, and you bring them into the United Kingdom to be used as a prostitute, then that person can be used, and I use that term deliberately, that person can be used repeatedly, day after day after day again. There's countless examples of cases we've been involved in where young women are being brought in, treated as sex slaves, and they're being asked to, I don't like the terminology, but to service men sort of 8 to 10 times per day. Well, those 8 to 10 times per day are producing a vast volume of money for the trafficker. And then the girls having to do the same again 7 days a week. And until they are just physically and emotionally burnt out, huge amounts of money that are being made. And, the history of human trafficking in the United Kingdom, if I go back 6-7 years, the annual reporting has gone up almost every year by about 30% every single year.
Every year.
Now, if you're involved in any type of crime and can report that the crime type has gone up 30% every single year, and that's even with the best efforts of law enforcement, and over the last number of years there's been really determined efforts in the United Kingdom to tackle human trafficking, but it has still risen 30% a year. That could be because of better reporting, it could be because of more incidents, it's always difficult to tell. But a crime type that's rising by 1/3 every single year is a highly, highly profitable and highly dangerous criminal activity.
Right. And thank you for bringing that up. I think my viewers and the public need to be aware of how big a problem that is. With that kind of, with that amount of volume of people and the financial implications for criminal organizations, it's a concern to say the least at the moment.
If I could just throw in an extra bit as well. If people think about organized crime in a buyer and seller construct, that would be helpful. Organized crime is the seller of the goods, right? They want you to buy whatever it is that they're selling, whether it's drugs, whether it's firearms, whether it's counterfeit goods, whether it's women or men in the trafficking world. If there wasn't a buyer, then there would be no market. So in parts of the United Kingdom, you see lots of examples of what we call pop-up brothels, which these are rented accommodation which are used for a week or 10 days. Girls appear for that 5-10 day period, and then they disappear. Now they're there because there is a market. If we could persuade people to not visit brothels, because to be absolutely clear, there are very few examples of young women, particularly those from outside the United Kingdom, very few examples of young women who, when they grow up, say, when I grow up, I want to be a prostitute. I want to be servicing 8 to 10 men per day in a bed sit in, East London or West Birmingham or the southern parts of, name any city in the United Kingdom. So if we can persuade particularly men to think, well, it's almost certain that this person doesn't want to do this, which is interesting because what that makes you, when you go into that brothel, when you go in, and we had a draft a promotional campaign in Northern Ireland, which we didn't use, which argued that if you go into a brothel in those circumstances, you may go in as a customer or as a punter, but you come out as a rapist.
Yeah.
You come out as a rapist. So almost inevitably, now there are legitimate sex workers who are doing this voluntarily, who absolutely do this knowing what they're involved in. But I think the greater number of people are there because they have been trafficked, and they're doing that because there is a requirement, and that's because we, the customers, are still saying, provide this service to me. So if we can change the dynamic, if we can get people to think about themselves as part of the solution, then we can really change the dynamic here.
The dynamics and the scale of the problem of that, it is a big problem across Europe, because Interpol are trying to close down some of the rat lines, obviously. How, in your opinion, this is just your opinion, how could we resolve this in the United Kingdom? There's not a quick fix, and there's not one thing to actually answer this. It's going to be a combination, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, much like managing the economy, I imagine it's about short movements of different pieces of activity at the same time. So there isn't, if there was a quick fix, then that quick fix would have been done some time ago. Organized crime thrives on a profit motivation. So we have to make it clear that people who are involved in this criminality, that they are at risk of losing that profit. They are at risk of not getting the profit. There needs to be a clear sense of a strong and robust law enforcement response to all elements of organized crime. There needs to be a public response to organized crime. People who will say, we don't want this activity in our neighborhood, in our towns, in our cities, and certainly not in our name. There needs to be a change in the slightly ambivalent attitude towards criminology, this type of criminality. I mean, the people that go and get their cars washed on a Saturday morning at the disused, garage forecourt, that are spending £5 and £6 to have their cars washed by, 7 or 8 Albanians. You have to ask yourself, how does someone go from living in Albania to washing 20 and 30 cars a day for, a penny a time? And then ask yourself, well, what is my role when I'm driving my 3 Series BMW in and spending £5? Could I do it myself? And if I do it myself, I change the market dynamic, and then actually I can change the way that human trafficking works, because human trafficking will then change. So a robust law enforcement response, a robust public response against organized crime, a very clear messaging from the UK government to say, we will legislate for it, we will enable the right capabilities to exist. There needs to be a pursuit from agencies such as the financial sector to absolutely report evidence of money laundering. And instead of putting the responsibility on the law enforcement, there needs to be that real due diligence from those in the financial market to say, we need to be alive to the fact that our financial systems are being exploited by organized criminals, and we have a positive duty to try to protect our systems and to report that criminality. And I think finally that the whole idea of having the public be able to stand up and say, when I see it, I'm going to report it. There is a zero tolerance to terrorism in the United Kingdom. If you asked 100 people in the street on the, as we used to say, the Clapham omnibus going through London, you asked 100 people, 99%, if not higher, would say terrorism is a bad thing and I would do whatever I can to report it.
Yeah.
Ask the same question around elements of what is organized crime, and you'll get a slightly ambivalent answer, I think, because people like the idea of a cheap bargain. They like the idea of their car being washed. They like the idea of being able to, to download a movie illegally. They like the idea of getting things free. They like the idea of perhaps a line or two of coke or smoking a joint at the weekend. And there's still an ambivalence towards that, not recognizing that at the end of that, there's still harm. The people who are farming the cocoa beans in South America, they're being exploited. They're not getting the big profits out of this. So when you're taking your line of coke in your cozy suburbs, on the long end chain of this, there's still farmers who are earning, virtually nothing from the drug manufacturers. So people just need to think a little differently and have a zero tolerance approach to organized crime as they do towards terrorism.
Yeah, I think I think the public could do a lot more. I think they see organized crime as not particularly their problem, but they don't realize with the overlaps with terrorism, it is a problem. It's connected.
Yeah.
And so I think people should take a little bit more responsibility for their actions as well. Reference the human trafficking side of things. I've worked on certain task forces coming across from the Middle East, Africa into Europe, and some of the things you can't even describe. Some of the things your experience, you've seen it as well. The human suffering of some of these girls is phenomenal.
Let me just allow me to share one example, if I may, Anthony, quickly. In Belfast, in Northern Ireland, one of my teams discovered a brothel being used by victims of human trafficking, and when we searched the place and we rescued one or two of the young girls, and they were Chinese, and we arrested the traffickers and we followed the line of the investigation. But it was a 3-story building. And at the very top floor of the building, in the middle of a very densely populated part of Belfast, there was a bedroom that was locked from the outside. And that's always a sure sign of something going on. And when we broke into that part of the room, there was nobody there. But what was interesting was that we found evidence of the person who had been there clawing at the door with their fingernails. Right, they were so desperate to get out, clawing it. The wood was marked as if an animal had been clawing at it.
Yeah.
We found evidence of a fingernail being embedded in the wood, and we were able to find evidence of the blood of the person who had literally bled their fingernails trying to get out. But what was interesting was that the person who had done that was not there. Now, that person's DNA was entered into the national system and wasn't identified because at that time she was an unknown and I think a legal Chinese victim of human trafficking. It was only 2 years later when the Metropolitan Police in London did a similar exercise and rescued this young woman and took her DNA and found that it matched the sample from 2 years earlier in Belfast. Now, over those 2 years, that young woman had been trafficked all around the United Kingdom. Now, what can happen to a person who's been trafficked over a 2-year period if at the start of her journey, She's clawing at the door in desperation to get out. What must that life have been like? And my challenge is, as I've said already, to the men particularly who go into these brothels thinking that they're paying for something from a young woman who wants to be an escort, as they call it. Almost certainly they're not. Almost certainly they're not. And just to challenge people to think, am I part of the problem and can I be part of the solution?
Very important. People can be part of this solution. I think that's very important. That's a very emotional story there, but it's very sad. It's not the only story. It happens too much. So I just want everyone just to take a couple of seconds and have a think about that one, about what Roy has just said there. So have a good think about it. Don't be part of the solution. So be part of the solution, not part of the problem on that one. What are the future challenges now for law enforcement the next 10 years on organized crime, on terrorism? What's your thoughts on that, Roy?
Well, the first immediate thought, Anthony, is we've had the last 12 months or so doing stuff like this online.
Yeah.
Right. So the world has increasingly moved onto the online cyber world. And I think the next battles will be fought remotely. They'll be fought digitally. They'll be fought by mice and by cyber warriors more so than by the traditional warriors that we're familiar with. I think the experience from those involved in organized crime, as I am, increasingly we see just about everything moving into that cyberspace. And we talk about either cyber crime or cyber-enabled crime, where the primary objective may be to carry out a drugs deal, but it can be enabled by the capabilities of the internet. And I think increasingly the journey of those people being trained today to be investigators will not have the same sort of training as those that were involved 10, 20, 30 years ago. The types of training is different because the world has changed. And likewise, as criminals, terrorists especially, move into the digital era, when they recruit people online, when they incentivize them to be part of their criminal or terrorist networks, then that's where law enforcement needs to be to identify the vulnerabilities of those groups. And I think increasingly go forward 5 years, go forward 10 years, increasingly the battle zones will be drawn in cyberspace more so than in the real world. Not because, if you're going to sell drugs, you still want a human at the end of it to to smoke it or to inhale it or whatever. So, but I think increasingly we're going to spend time in that cyber world as the most obvious bit. I think the transfer of money has just become incredibly easy, and there's a real challenge to those in the financial sector to step up their game and to make sure that they are playing their part in identifying the criminal activity that's going on their systems. And the likes of the Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and places like that, have to be engaged. They have to almost be deputized in the old sort of Wild West version to be part of that live campaign to identify criminality that is taking place, and to step away from the notion that they are simply platforms that other people use for their own purposes. They have to be part of an active solution to the problem where their platforms are being used. And the other thing is, finally, I suppose for every success that law enforcement has against either a terrorist group or an organized crime group, the good, and I mean this in the sense of the professional, the sophisticated terrorist groups and organized crime groups conduct a debrief in the same way as law enforcement does. They look at themselves and say, what did we do wrong that enabled the police to find us? And so I think we need to be entering into a real sense of a learning and a sharing environment where the good work that is being done by law enforcement around the world has to be more rapidly shared around with the other good actors in agencies and in national institutions. And I think a lot of that is going on. There's lots of work, particularly amongst the Five Eyes community in the English-speaking worlds of Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, but that kind of community of good actors has to be strengthened to make sure that we are consistently learning what the bad guys are doing in the different parts of the world. And it shouldn't be the occasional conference that happens in somewhere in the world where you learn where things have happened. It should be built into the law enforcement response that we rapidly share what is happening so that the emerging criminality is recognized sooner.
I think the flow of information, the flow of intelligence, time-sensitive intelligence and information that needs to open up now. Not between one country, but they need to get it out there. Because if you're going to close down the Ratlins or you're going to look at the financial institutions, no country can stand independent on this. Information needs to be shared. And if we're holding back one little bit of information, that might be the key part that another country needs to close the network down. We could speak obviously about a lot of other things on this one, but I'd say, Roy, thank you so much for coming on to the show. And it has been very emotional, very informative, and I hope my viewers gain some insight into a couple of these subjects there that people generally do not speak about. So thank you so much. If you
My
can
pleasure.
stay on the line, but I'd say thank you for everyone for watching the Patriot Show. Roy, would you like to say anything else?
It's been a good chat. The time has flown past. We could spend twice as long, 3 times as long. It's an interesting subject, and if I leave with one other person who's listening to this conversation, thinking that they can be part of the solution and they can help one other person, then that spiraling of information, that spiraling of sharing of better practice, and that ability to stop crime works best when good-minded, civil-minded people step up and step forward and do their part. So thank you for the opportunity, Anthony. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Right, it's been a pleasure having you on the show as well. Right, everyone, I'd like to say thank you for watching the Patriot Show. Please watch some of the adverts at the end of the show, little short videos to promote veteran-owned companies both in the United Kingdom and in the United States as well. Thank you, everyone. Take care and stay safe. Goodbye.